welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on, well, a truly monumental task.
That might be an understatement.
A listener requested a full, comprehensive deep dive into the sweep of South African history. I mean, a chronological exploration from its deepest ancient roots,
Yes.
right up to the critical challenges that are defining it today.
This is, I think, the longest story we've ever attempted to tell. We're talking millions of years. It's paleontology, it's ancient kingdoms, huge colonial wars,
Right.
and then the establishment and, of course, the dismantling of apartheid and this ongoing struggle to build a democracy. It is a history of, well, profound injustice and just extraordinary resilience.
And our sources give us this incredibly detailed stack. So our mission here is to transform this dense, layered timeline into something clear, something digestible. We want to give you those aha moments that explain exactly how this incredibly complex and, frankly, globally significant nation was forged. So let's unpack this entire history.
Let's do it.
We have to start, I guess, not with centuries, but with epochs.
Exactly. I mean, we have to establish South Africa's place. It's widely accepted as the place of origin for our species, Homo sapiens. It stands at the absolute forefront of paleontological research. It is, quite literally, the cradle of humankind.
Yeah, and that deep history, it's just astounding. It's all documented through discoveries that, fundamentally rewrote our entire understanding of human evolution.
It did.
We're talking about the famous discovery of the skull of the Tong child back in 1924.
Right, which was critical evidence for early hominids in Africa. And that was, just the start. The incredible wealth of hominid fossils just keeps coming from places like the Sterkfontein Caves.
Which is a World Heritage Site.
A World Heritage Site, yes. These caves have given us some of the most complete records of our early ancestors. We're talking about famous finds like Mrs. Pluz and Littlefoot. These finds show an unbroken chain of human and pre-human life in that region, stretching back millions of years.
And the timescale for modern humans, for us, is equally staggering. The consensus is that Homo sapiens originated in Africa somewhere between, 350,000 and 260,000 years ago?
That's right. And crucially, we know that anatomically modern humans have lived continuously in the region for over 100,000 years.
Wow.
And we see further evidence of this from really groundbreaking archaeological work at sites like Blombos Cave in the Southern Cape.
What do they find there?
Well, Blombos Cave revealed some of the oldest examples of art and symbolic thought anywhere in the world. Things like engraved ochre pieces, dated to roughly 75,000 years ago.
So this isn't just about survival. This is complex, developed culture.
Exactly. Tens of thousands of years before we see comparable developments anywhere else.
And of course, the most enduring evidence of that Stone Age culture comes from the earliest known residents, the ancestors of the sand. Their legacy is literally painted across the landscape in that magnificent sand rock art.
Which shows these incredibly detailed scenes of hunting, rituals, daily life. It's a window into a world that's now lost.
So as we move forward in time, maybe about 2,000 years ago, we start to see a distinction between the early inhabitants, who we collectively call the Khoisan.
We do. The San were these small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers, highly adapted to their environments, often in these remote, semi-arid regions.
And then there's a key cultural innovation that sort of splits them, right? The Khoi.
Yes, the Khoi adopted a pastoralist lifestyle. About 2,000 years ago, they started herding sheep and then later cattle.
Why was that shift to herding so crucial in shaping what came next?
Well, it fundamentally changed their social structure and their movement. Pastoralism allows for larger social groups, and it required them to seek out these specific, resource-rich coastal pasture lands.
So they moved towards the coasts.
They moved towards the coast, and this gave them a distinct economic advantage. It made them the dominant group across the Cape regions for centuries.
But that demographic landscape was about to change again, pretty drastically. Starting around 350 BCE and really accelerating around 300 CE, entirely new cultures start arriving from the north.
Right. This is part of the broader, millennia-long Bantu expansion.
And who were they?
These were the Bantu-speaking agro-pastoralists, and they brought a completely different technological package with them.
Okay.
They introduced Iron Age culture, the skills of ironworking for better tools and weapons, and crucially, the knowledge of cultivating domesticated crops. This allowed for permanent, settled farming villages.
So this was a genuine structural transformation.
Absolutely. As the Bantu speakers migrated south, they inevitably encountered and then either displaced or absorbed the existing Khoisan groups. This expansion established the major ethnic and linguistic groups we recognize across South Africa today, putting down deep cultural roots long before any Europeans arrived.
And that massive shift eventually leads to political consolidation. The most significant example is the Kingdom of Mapungubwe.
The first known kingdom in the region, yes. It was situated strategically in the Limpopo-Shashe Basin, perfectly placed to interact with northern trade networks.
What's so fascinating about Mapungubwe is how its physical layout actually reflected its political system.
That's right. The elite didn't live among the general population. They lived up on the flat-topped summit of Mapungubwe Hill.
And that separation was key to developing what historians call sacral kingship.
It's a key nugget of knowledge that sacral kingship means the ruler's political authority comes from their religious or sacred functions. In a drought-prone region, rainmaking was a vital ritual.
Of course.
So the king's role as the central rainmaker solidified his untouchable status and his control over resources. It was a very sophisticated system of state control.
And their economy proves they weren't just isolated farmers. Mapungubwe got incredibly wealthy through its role as a key hub for the Indian Ocean trade.
Exactly. They were trading gold and ivory north in exchange for manufactured goods, glass beads, even Chinese porcelain.
Wow.
The capital grew rapidly. By 1250, it had a population of about 5,000 people, and its political reach extended over 30,000 square kilometers.
So it's rightly seen as the forerunner to later, more famous states like Great Zimbabwe.
It's the direct political and cultural forerunner, yes.
But kingdoms are vulnerable to, well, shifting economic winds. Mapungubwe collapsed around 1300 CE.
It did. And the collapse is strongly linked to international dynamics. Specifically, the trade routes shifted north from the Limpopo to the Zambezi River.
And that shift just starved it of income.
Fundamentally, it starved Mapungubwe of the commercial income it needed to sustain its large elite class. This precipitated the rise of Great Zimbabwe as the new power center. Mapungubwe Hill was abandoned, and its memory faded for centuries until modern archaeology brought its story back to life.
So now we jump forward a couple of centuries to the start of the Maritime era, which, this just forever altered South Africa's destiny.
It did, and the impetus was entirely logistical. European powers needed an alternate sea route to Asia to bypass the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire increasingly controlled the Silk Road.
This brings the Portuguese explorers south. Bartolomeu Dias in 1488, but the real breakthrough was Vasco da Gama in 1497.
Right, he rounded the Cape of Good Hope and established the full route to India. And suddenly, the southern tip of Africa becomes strategically vital.
But only as a port of call, a resupply stop.
Exactly. The Portuguese didn't stick around. It took the Dutch East India Company, the VOC.
Which was one of the most powerful corporations in the world at the time.
Absolutely. They established the first permanent European settlement in 1652, led by Jan van Riebeck.
And the intention was purely mercenary.
Purely. The VOC needed a permanent warehouse and garden to resupply their ships with fresh water, meat, vegetables, to combat scurvy.
But as their needs grew, so did the friction with the local Khoisan.
Over grazing land and cattle. And this friction led to the very first colonial wars in the region.
So the Dutch Cape Colony exists for over a century, transforming the ecology, introducing slavery and this racial hierarchy. But then global events intervene.
The Napoleonic Wars. The British, fearing the Cape would fall into French hands, occupied the colony in 1806 and then formalized the takeover in 1814.
And this change in colonial masters was crucial.
It was. The British introduced a more centralized bureaucracy, new policies on labor and land, which deeply unsettled many of the existing Dutch settlers, the Boers.
This tension leads directly to the Great Trek in the early 19th century.
It does. Thousands of Dutch settlers, the Voortrekkers, departed the Cape Colony, migrating inland to find land and freedom from British control.
And this was a massive territorial expansion that resulted in the founding of the independent Boer republics, the Zaire, or Transvaal, the Natalia Republic, and the Orange Free State.
But, and this is the crucial point, this expansion was never into empty land.
No, it came at the massive, devastating expense of established indigenous groups. The Cape Colony was systematically expanding, pushing back groups like the Botswana and Griqua.
And we need to talk about the Xhosa Wars. These are also known as the Cape Frontier Wars. This was the longest, most sustained colonial conflict in South Africa's history.
Spanning almost 7 decades.
From 1811 to 1879. These were a relentless series of wars driven by colonial encroachment, with the British constantly trying to push their eastern border further into Xhosa territory.
Can you give us a concrete example of just how brutal this process was?
Absolutely. If you look at the Sixth Xhosa War, A crucial moment was the killing of Chief Hintsa Kakawuta. He was supposed to be in parley with the Cape Government Commando Party.
They killed him.
They killed him. His death was seen as an outright execution of a sovereign leader. It signaled the ultimate colonial strategy, not negotiation, but subjugation.
And at the same time, another great indigenous power dynamic was playing out in the southeast.
Right. The rise and fall of the Ndwandwe Kingdom, which created a period of massive upheaval known as the Mfecane. This instability ultimately cleared the path for the explosive rise of the powerful Zulu kingdom under leaders like Shaka.
So this fundamentally restructured the political map of the region.
It did. And it's important to see these conflicts, the Xhosa Wars and the rise of the Zulu, as the necessary prelude. The colonial powers had to defeat and dispossess the indigenous political structures before they could fully exploit the resources that were about to be discovered.
And that resource discovery changes absolutely everything. If the European arrival was the spark, the mineral revolution in the late 19th century was the engine that built modern South Africa.
And cemented its structural racism. It was a true global turning point. It started with diamonds on the Vaal River in the late 1860s.
Then the massive dry pipe deposits at Kimberley,
which became the world's largest diamond deposit, kickstarting Africa's first great industrial hub.
But the real game changer was gold, discovered in 1884 on the Witwatersrand, around modern-day Johannesburg.
And the Rand gold reefs were enormous, but they were deep and difficult to mine. They required massive capital and a huge, constant supply of cheap labor.
And this just intensified the political tension. For the British, controlling these resources became paramount.
Which created massive conflict with the Boer republics, especially the Zaire, which was sitting right on top of the gold.
The British acted fast, annexing the diamond fields in 1871. And the key figure in all of this was Cecil John Rhodes.
Rhodes was a titan of finance and an unabashed imperialist. He created the massive De Beers diamond monopoly by 1888. But what's the real nugget here?
Go on.
It's the lasting structural impact of the mineral revolution, the creation of the migrant labor system.
Okay, let's unpack that. How did the mining industry lay the actual foundation for apartheid?
Well, to keep costs low, mine owners needed a massive, easily controlled workforce, so they created the migrant labor system. Black men were forced off their land, the new reserves, and required to work in the mines for fixed periods.
Living in segregated, closed compounds.
Far from their families, yes. Their only identity was tied to the past they carried. This system denied them permanent residency in urban areas and prevented them from unionizing. This was the economic blueprint for apartheid's entire control mechanism, decades before apartheid was even a word.
And Rhodes leveraged this wealth to become Prime Minister of the Cape, and then he used his British South Africa Company to go on and conquer Zambia and Zimbabwe.
So this tension between British ambition and Boer independence over the gold was destined to erupt. And it did, with the First Anglo-Boer War in 1880.
Triggered by the British annexation of the Zaire in 1877.
Right, part of a British scheme for a consolidated Southern African Confederation. The Boers revolted and, surprisingly, won a decisive victory at the Battle of Majuba Hill.
Which forced the British to back down, at least for a while. The Zaire regained self-government and Paul Kruger became its president.
But the gold under Kruger's republic was just too valuable for Britain to ignore. The Second Anglo-Boer War, from 1899 to 1902, was a massive three-phase global conflict.
Initially, the Boers were very successful, right?
Yeah.
They had superior knowledge of the terrain, they were excellent marksmen.
They were. They mounted preemptive strikes, besieged cities like Ladysmith and Kimberley, and won famous victories at Colenso and Spienkop.
Now, Spienkop, that's a really interesting and tragic story of military failure.
It's a stark example. British troops captured the summit, which they thought was a strategic point. But when the fog lifted, they realized they were completely exposed to Boer gun emplacements on higher surrounding positions.
It was a trap.
Essentially. The tragedy wasn't just the exposure, it was the chaos of command. Poor communication, contradictory orders. They kept reinforcing exposed positions, leading to immense casualties. It became a symbol of early British failure.
So in the second phase, the British send this colossal force under Roberts and Kitchener. They relieve the cities, occupy the Boer capitals, but the war still isn't over.
No, the Boers pivot to a brutal and highly effective guerrilla campaign for another 2 years.
And Lord Kitchener's response was devastating.
It was. He implemented extreme scorched earth policies, systematically burning Boer farms and homesteads to deny the fighters supplies and shelter.
And this led directly to the forced relocation of over 100,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children, into what the British called refugee camps.
We know them today, infamously, as concentration camps.
And the human cost was just horrific.
It was. An estimated 26,000 Boer women and children died, mostly from disease and neglect. And this part is often forgotten, the British also interned Black Africans, which resulted in the deaths of over 14,000 Black inmates.
The war finally ended with the Treaty of Reneging in May 1902. The Boer republics became British colonies.
And crucially, the terms of that peace treaty paved the way for white political unity by postponing the question of African franchise. This guaranteed that the political future would be decided exclusively by the white minority.
That is the essential transition point. That treaty guaranteed that the next step, the creation of a unified nation, would be built on a foundation of white supremacy.
And the groundwork for formal segregation was laid immediately after the war. The system of racial economic stratification from the mines was rapidly applied nationwide through legislation.
We see acts like the General Pass Regulations Act of 1905 denying Black people the vote and restricting their movement.
And the Asiatic Registration Act of 1906 targeting the Indian population in the Transvaal, requiring them to register and carry passes.
Which was famously resisted by Mahatma Gandhi.
It was. And by 1906, the South African Native Affairs Commission was already implementing openly segregationist policies across the entire region.
The economic driver, though, it's still the mines.
Always the mines. Owners wanted to cut costs using cheaper Black labor in semi-skilled roles, which sparked intense industrial tension with the established white labor force.
Right. They wanted to protect their high wages and privileged status.
So we see this tension explode into violence. In 1920, 71,000 Black mine workers went on strike. It was quickly and brutally suppressed.
And then the famous 1922 rebellion, but this time by white workers.
Yes, protesting the proposed employment of Black workers in higher-grade jobs. The revolt became so violent that the Smuts government had to deploy the military, including aircraft, to crush it.
And the state's response to this was very telling.
It was. To ensure stability and secure the support of the white working class, the government sided with white labor. This culminated in the Color Bar Act of 1926.
So what was the specific practical effect of that law?
The Color Bar Act made racial economic stratification a legal reality. It legally prevented Black mine workers from getting certificates for skilled trades, ensuring high-wage jobs remained the exclusive preserve of the white minority. It codified the idea that race determined economic opportunity.
The ultimate vehicle for cementing all of this was the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910.
May 31st, 1910, the 4 former colonies unified into a self-governing dominion within the British Empire.
And the foundational document, the South Africa Act, was deeply exclusionary by design.
It granted political control exclusively to the white minority and explicitly removed the right of Black people to even sit in Parliament.
With that total political control secured, the government initiated the systematic land grab that would define the next century. Let's talk about the devastating impact of the Native Land Act of 1913.
This act was a cataclysm. It legally prevented Black people from buying, occupying, or owning land outside of specified, heavily restricted reserves.
And these reserves made up what percentage of the land?
About 7% of the total land area. It set aside over 80% of the land for the white minority, who were less than 20% of the population. This instantly created landlessness and economic dependency for the majority.
And this was later solidified by the Native Land and Trust Act in 1936.
Yes, which slightly expanded the reserves to about 13%, but ensured they remained poor, overpopulated, and unable to sustain the population, thus guaranteeing that constant supply of cheap migrant labor for the mines and farms.
And finally, to ensure total administrative control, there was the Native Administration Act of 1927.
Which made the British Crown, meaning the white government, the supreme head over all African affairs, effectively neutralizing the political authority of existing paramount chiefs.
Now, the World Wars acted as this unexpected catalyst for massive internal shifts. When World War II broke out, Prime Minister Jan Smuts declared war on Germany.
Right, and South Africa contributed significantly. 334,000 men volunteered, and a substantial number were non-white, 77,000 Blacks, 46,000 coloreds and Asians, though they were generally confined to non-combatant roles.
But this participation was deeply controversial at home.
Very. The Afrikaner nationalist opposition was highly visible. The Osawa Brandwag, or Oxwagon Sentinel, became militant. They openly opposed the war, modeling their paramilitary wing on the Nazi SA, and even carrying out sabotage attacks.
And here's where the lasting internal impact happens. The wartime shortage of white labor forced industrial centers to rapidly hire black workers.
which led to a massive acceleration of black migration and urbanization into key industrial centers.
And the government completely failed to provide housing or social services for this massive influx.
Miserably. The result was extreme overcrowding, the rapid growth of shantytowns, rising crime, and intense social disillusionment.
And this demographic pressure provided the political fuel for resistance. The urban black population, increasingly aware of global movements for self-determination, began demanding rights.
Which led to the resurgence of the ANC Youth League and the powerful Council of Non-European Trade Unions, positioning them for the direct confrontation that was about to unfold.
That confrontation arrived in 1948 when the National Party won the election on a platform of apartheid.
Africans for Apartness. And this wasn't just segregation, it was a total legal project to institutionalize white supremacy and limit all forms of contact between races.
And they moved with extraordinary speed. The first target was intimacy, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act in 1949.
Followed by the Immorality Amendment Act in 1950, which illegalized sexual relations between white and non-white persons. They were legislating who you could love.
But the true engine of social control was the Population Registration Act of 1950.
This act classified every single citizen into one of 4 rigid racial groups: white, native, colored, and later Indian.
And that classification determined everything: your rights, your freedoms, where you could live.
Everything. The methods were often arbitrary and demeaning. Classification boards used things like the infamous pencil test, seeing if a pencil stuck in your hair, skin color, facial features.
It's just grotesque.
It was. And these arbitrary decisions often tore families apart if members were classified differently.
And alongside this was the Group Areas Act of 1950.
Which formalized the idea of separate development. It dictated where each racial group could live, leading to the massive, systematic forced removals from historically integrated urban areas like Sophiatown or District 6.
And the final piece of this puzzle was the creation of the Bantustans, or homelands.
Right. Through the Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959, the intention here wasn't genuine independence. It was to strip Black South Africans of their national citizenship by assigning them to one of 10 impoverished, fragmented homelands.
So the goal was to make the white minority 100% of the citizens of South Africa.
Precisely. While the black majority became foreign nationals tied to non-viable political entities.
This systemic repression was met with determined resistance. Nelson Mandela became vice president of the ANC in 1952 and was central to the Defiance Campaign.
And this resistance peaked in 1955 with the Congress of the People, which adopted the powerful Freedom Charter.
With that famous opening line, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white."
The government's reaction was extreme. They arrested 150 leaders, charging them with high treason. The treason trial lasted for 4 agonizing years.
Why does the length of that trial matter so much?
Because the state's case ultimately collapsed. The acquittal of most defendants, including Mandela, was an immense moral and legal victory. It showed that the state couldn't legally prove that demanding equality was the same as violent treason.
But the mood shifted tragically in March 1960 with the Sharpeville massacre.
This was the point of no return. Police opened fire on unarmed PAC protesters. At least 69 people were killed, over 180 wounded. The government declared a state of emergency and banned the ANC and PAC.
And for Mandela, this finalized the conclusion that nonviolent means were insufficient.
It did. In 1961, he co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK's Spear of the Nation, the armed wing, in association with the SACP.
And MK initially adopted a strategy of sabotage,
Targeting critical infrastructure, aiming to pressure the state without maximizing civilian casualties. Mandela went underground, becoming the Black Pimpernel.
His time as a fugitive ended in 1962. After the Rivonia trial in 1964, he and his co-accused were sentenced to life in prison.
The international campaign Save These Lives was decisive in preventing the death penalty. Mandela then spent 18 years on Robben Island.
Under a brutal regime designed to break the political prisoners.
Hard labor in a lime quarry, which permanently damaged his eyesight. Isolation, censored letters. But his imprisonment transformed him into a globally recognized symbol of the anti-apartheid movement.
And the apartheid regime managed to survive for so long because of the Cold War. It marketed itself to the West as a crucial bulwark against communism.
This anti-communist position led directly to the long and complex South African border war from 1966 to 1990.
Centered on the illegally occupied territory of Namibia.
Yes, which South Africa used as a base to fight communist-backed forces in neighboring Angola. The SADF fought SWAPO's military wing plan, which was heavily backed by the Soviet Union and Cuban troops.
The dynamics were intense, especially in the 1980s. The SADF launched massive incursions into Angola,
Like Operation Protea in 1981. But the Soviet willingness to supply advanced technology like MiG-23 fighter jets changed the equation. By 1988, the skies over Angola were highly contested.
So the cost of the war, financially, militarily, diplomatically, became unsustainable.
Especially as internal resistance grew. This reality paved the way for negotiations, culminating in the Tripartite Accord in 1988.
And that agreement was vital. South Africa agreed to withdraw from Namibia, which gained independence, in exchange for a Cuban withdrawal from Angola.
The end of the Cold War essentially eliminated the apartheid regime's primary external defense narrative.
And internally, the 1980s saw this dangerous escalation of violence. Black townships became ungovernable.
Through rent boycotts, militant youth action, the struggle in the townships was horrific. There was violence like necklacing of suspected government agents, while MK militants continued their armed attacks.
Internationally, sanctions finally began to bite. The U.S. Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986.
And the withdrawal of major companies caused significant economic stagnation. Combined with the military burden of the border war, it made maintaining apartheid economically impossible.
The stalemate broke when F.W. de Klerk succeeded P.W. Botha in 1989.
De Klerk, recognizing the untenable situation, moved decisively. In February 1990, he repealed discriminatory laws, lifted the ban on the ANC, and committed to releasing Nelson Mandela.
Mandela walked out of prison a free man on February 11, 1990.
The initial negotiation phase began with the Groot Schuur Minute in May 1990, setting the terms for talks. But crucially, the transition was marred by catastrophic political violence.
Clashes between ANC supporters and supporters of the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP.
Yes, areas like Katlehong became sites of mass violence. Many feared the country was on the brink of civil war.
And that violence nearly derailed everything, especially after the assassination of Chris Hanani in April 1993.
It was Nelson Mandela's immediate, calm, nationally televised appeal for peace that managed to avert a massive escalation.
Despite all that, the Multi-Party Negotiating Forum ratified the interim constitution in November 1993.
Which allowed the transition to continue. Mandela and de Klerk were rightly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for managing this intensely volatile period.
And the culmination of this monumental struggle arrived in April 1994 with the first democratic, non-racial election.
On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black chief executive. A moment of global celebration, televised to 1 billion viewers.
His defining legacy was reconciliation. He headed a government of national unity that deliberately included F.W. de Klerk as a deputy president.
A profound act of inclusion that was critical for stability.
Beyond domestic policy, Mandela embraced the African Renaissance, positioning the new South Africa as a moral leader on the continent.
He mediated conflicts like the Burundian Civil War. There is also a notable SADC military operation in Lesotho in 1998 to protect the government after a disputed election.
Okay, let's shift to the economic framework. Initially, the ANC had the Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP.
Right,
Yeah.
aiming for state-led transformation, housing, social upliftment, but that was short-lived.
By 1996, it was largely abandoned for the Growth, Employment, and Redistribution Strategy, or GEAR.
Which was a profound ideological shift. GEAR focused on fiscal discipline, privatization, and market liberalization.
And critics viewed this as an adoption of neoliberal tenets, historically unsuitable for South Africa's unique situation.
The critique was that GEAR relied almost wholly on the private sector to respond to market signals. It failed to acknowledge that the inherited structural inequalities of apartheid required massive state-led social spending and intervention to address the needs of the majority.
So critics argue that GEAR actually entrenched, rather than dismantled, the basic economic architecture of the apartheid system.
That's the argument, yes.
The democratic era was formally cemented with the current constitution in 1996, which is celebrated for its detailed Bill of Rights.
And for establishing a clear judicial system centered around the Constitutional Court to protect those rights.
But the single greatest unresolved legacy of injustice remains land.
Absolutely. Post-1994, legislation was introduced to promote land redistribution, but the challenge remains a massive, volatile stalemate.
Why? What's crippled the progress?
Several things: systemic backlogs, bureaucratic incompetence, and critically elite capture.
Okay, let's pause there. What exactly is elite capture in this context?
It's when policies intended to benefit the marginalized, like land reform, are instead co-opted or manipulated by wealthy insiders or politically connected figures for their own personal gain.
So the land and money go to the connected, not the historical claimant.
That's the core of it. The debate remains highly charged, which culminated in the new Expropriation Act signed into law in January 2025.
This grants the state the power to take land in certain cases without compensation.
The stated aim is to fast-track historical redress. However, critics warn this could erode property rights and severely undermine investor confidence. It is the defining political and economic gamble of the next generation.
And compounding this is the rampant rise of corruption, which peaked during the infamous state capture period under President Jacob Zuma.
We saw government institutions systematically weakened and resources funneled to private interests. Take the Raid Dairy Project in 2012. Almost all $250 million intended for black dairy farmers was allegedly stolen by the Gupta family and a former premier.
The examples are endless. The VBS Mutual Bank collapse, the Bosasa bribes, state capture was systemic looting.
This corruption has led directly to the profound Eskom crisis, the breakdown of the national power utility,
Resulting in chronic load shedding, these scheduled power cuts that have crippled the economy.
and it goes beyond just poor maintenance. There's evidence of outright sabotage and rampant procurement fraud at power plants.
Which is where local innovation comes in. While the national grid struggles, Cape Town, for example, has started its Cash for Power program.
Right, allowing households to sell excess solar power back to the city's grid, a critical, localized step toward energy independence.
This backdrop of stagnation and corruption led to the genuinely historical political shift in the 2024 elections.
For the first time since 1994, the ANC lost its electoral majority, signaling a fundamental structural change in the country's political landscape.
In this complex modern context, Cape Town often serves as a microcosm of South Africa's duality.
It does. On one hand, you have a thriving, globally connected economy. It's Africa's major tech hub. You have good local governance, investment in infrastructure.
On the other hand, the legacy of apartheid remains brutally visible. Widespread violent crime in the poorer, segregated areas, necessitating an ongoing military presence since 2019.
The duality is stark. Economic success in the center, grappling with profound social instability on the periphery.
So we have completed an incredible journey. We've traveled from the earliest hominids through powerful ancient kingdoms, the trauma of colonial expansion, the bloody Anglo-Boer Wars, and the brutal legal architecture of apartheid.
And then tracked the extraordinary, resilient struggle for liberation and arrived at the complex realities of the democratic state, grappling with inequality, corruption, and energy instability.
The history of South Africa seems to be defined by this tension between immense, concentrated wealth and profound, institutionalized injustice.
And what's absolutely fascinating is how these key moments are all inextricably linked to specific pieces of legislation. Formal systems, whether it's the 1913 Land Act or the 1950 Group Areas Act, designed both to oppress and ultimately to govern a new, struggling nation.
So what does this entire journey mean for you, the listener? This history highlights that national destiny isn't some predetermined fate. It's a series of profound, often violent, and always consequential choices made through specific policy decisions.
The choices made in 1913 directly created the crisis being faced in 2025.
And this brings us to a final provocative thought. Given the recent passage of the new Expropriation Act in 2025, this latest legislative attempt to address historical dispossession and the immense public demand for land reform.
How might this dramatically heightened struggle between economic viability and social justice fundamentally shape the country's trajectory, for better or worse, over the next 50 years? That truly is the next chapter for the world to watch.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.